4:59 here. Okay. Okay. Whenever you're ready. Good afternoon. It's Torah Tuesday. And my name is Jerry Watkins, and we're going to look at the Torah today. Since I usually forget, let me open in prayer. Well, Father God, thank you for the day. Thanks for the beautiful, if warm weather. Thank you for your feast days that we're in the midst of. Thank you for the good Yom Kippur that we had the other day. And we look forward to Sukkot coming up. And I just want to thank you for the blessing of this group of people that decided to come look at your Torah tonight. And I'd ask that you would bless our conversation. There are some interesting things to talk about, and just guide us. I know you have something here for each of us. In Yeshua's name, amen. So let's see, one of the things I need to do to make sure I don't forget is to say that we won't be here next week. Next week is Sukkot, and we'll be up in the mountains. If it were Sukkot, if you want to know more about the way we're celebrating Sukkot, it's on the website, livingmessiah.com. We'll be at Wilderness Ranch, which is up 10 miles or so from Show Low. And we've done that for the past 3 or 4 years in a row. So that's where we're going to be next week. But the week following, we'll be back, and we'll just continue on where we left off. So that's the deal. And everybody that is not here to hear that, oh well. Let's see. So let's go back and review where we were last week. Last week we kind of finished with the death of Rachel and Isaac. And let's see, does anybody remember where Rachel died, what the circumstances of her death were? John's not here, so John would normally raise his hand and say something. But here he is. So John would tell us, we were asking what were the circumstances of Rachel's death.
Well, I thought you were going to ask where was Rachel buried. Where was Rachel buried?
That's good enough.
Rachel's tomb.
Who was buried in Rachel's tomb? Is that what you mean? Okay. So Jacob and his family were leaving Shechem after his sons had basically decimated the male population of the town. And Jacob felt like they needed to leave because they were going to be an object of scorn amongst all the neighbors. So they were leaving. They were going south. And they were on their way between Bethel and Hebron when it came time for Rachel to have her second son, who was at first named by her Ben-Oni, which means son of my sorrows. But Jacob changed the name from Ben-Oni to Ben-Yamin, which means son of my right hand. So Benjamin, the second and final offspring of Rachel, she died in childbirth. And that was on the road between essentially Bethel and Hebron. And there's still a building there that's noted to be Rachel's tomb. Obviously, with all of these things, you can take them with a grain of salt, but it fits all the biblical structure, and it certainly could be. There's no reason to think it wouldn't be. And then chapter 35 in Genesis, 36. Chapter 36 in Genesis is dedicated to Esau's descendants. It's a big bunch of stuff about Esau and all of his sons and his sons' sons and all this kind of stuff. There's a couple of noteworthy things in there. One was that one of Esau's, it would be his grandson. One of Esau's grandson was named Amalek, and the Amalekites are a thorn in the Israelite side for many years. And so if anybody ever asks you, well, where did Amalek come from? Amalek was a descendant of Esau. And then we also were able to deduce that somehow or another, whether Isaac told him to or whether something else happened, Esau moved, he and his progeny, if you will, his family, his wives and everybody, over to Seir, or Edom, which was around over here. Edom was actually right down there. If you read that word, that word there says Edom. And it was at the southwest corner of the Dead Sea. Today, if you ever go to Petra, Petra's over in here. Anyway, the people that lived there at the time of Esau were the Horites, and a lot of the genealogy basically would imply that Esau and his family went over, his clan went over and either intermarried or conquered the Horites. And so the Edomites became the offspring of Esau and the Horites. And I always like to ask the question, name a famous Edomite, and the best answer for that is Herod the Great. Herod the Great was an Idumean, I think they called it. That's what the Romans called Edom, was Idumea. Enough of a review. Does anybody have any questions or anything about that stuff? Otherwise, we'll move on. Well, no, we'll just move on. I should have some glasses up here somewhere. Chapter 37. Says, Jacob lived in a land where his father had stayed, in the land of Canaan. Then it says, this is an account of Jacob, and the very next word is Joseph. So that's always struck me as kind of funny. This is an account of Jacob. Then it says, Joseph, a young man of 17. Anyway, where is this? Do you know where they were at the time that we would read about this Joseph, a young man of 17? It says later on, but they're in Hebron. Hebron, let's see, Hebron is, oops, go there, right there. I can't see that, but you can see Hebron right there. It's south of Bethlehem, Jerusalem, Bethel, Shiloh, Shechem. Okay, so Shechem is where they, you know the story of Shechem and Dinah and all of that. Anyway, they had been coming down there, and they were living essentially in Hebron. So let me read a little about Joseph, starting in verse 2. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made him a richly ornamented robe. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told, let me stop there before we talk about the dream. The Bible is amazing the way it can take just a few sentences. That's just 3 verses, and there's all kinds of stuff packed in those 3 verses. First of all, how old was Joseph? It says right there he was 17. So that gives you an idea that of the time difference, if you will, or the time involved that has elapsed since they've left Laban and some of the other stuff that's gone on. It's been a while. And Joseph is 17, is tending his flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And let's see, he brought to his father a bad report. That's all it says, is a bad report. There's been a lot of controversy. It's all conjecture, but let's see, is it real clear at this point that Joseph has a favorite wife? It's real clear. And it's probably real clear to everybody in the family, right? I mean, whenever the sons, the 4 eldest sons of Leah decided to go massacre the Shechemites because of their violation of their sister, Dinah, there was an incident there that would imply that Jacob was not in control of his family. His family, those guys they're older. They're quite a bit older than Joseph at 17, right? So they're probably in their 20s, maybe even 30s. And they were the ones that decided to go massacre the Shechemites. Certainly not Jacob. Jacob was quite offended and quite upset about the whole thing. So there's already a great deal of dissension in that family. Marvin?
Yeah, it's been a while. I mean, at this point, it's been a while since Shechem.
Yes, it has.
Okay.
Yes.
But wouldn't you think that Jacob would have really from that point on, kept those kids on a real short leash?
You'd think.
Even 17 years later, after what they did.
Yep.
And what they're going to do.
Yep.
But anyhow.
You'd think. But instead of that, Jacob basically doesn't have any trouble showing his total favoritism to Joseph, right? To the extent of this 17-year-old whippersnapper gets favored by his father and gets given this richly ornamented coat that none of them got anything like, right? They grew up thinking of themselves as second-class citizens, right? They knew that Jacob loved Rachel more than Leah. They had to have known that. And imagine worse than that, being the son of one of the concubines. Those guys had to feel like real dog meat, right? Because Jacob made no bones about this. He didn't treat those wives as equal. He had a favorite, and he always felt cheated out of Rachel. Rachel was supposed to be his wife, right? And he got deceived by his father-in-law Laban. So the only reason I bring this up is I think it's instructive to kind of think about the atmosphere that must have been going on at the family at this time. I don't think he used to sit down every night at dinner and talk about all the fun times they had or anything like that. I'm sure they were able to communicate well enough to interact, but there was a whole bunch of animosity that was kind of bubbling along at the seams of things. Marvin?
Another question. How much of this animosity you think is due to the events in Shechem? Because that would have an impact on it too, because we don't hear about him. At least I don't remember that we hear about him favoring being upset with his sons before Shechem.
No, that's true.
And
that's
so
true.
that probably left a really, really
bitter taste.
Yeah,
well, I think it's interesting. If you go back to that whole incident in Shechem, see, it's chapter 34. The very end of chapter 34, when Jacob finds out what Levi and Simeon and all the others have done to the men of Shechem, in verse 30 it says, "Then Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, 'You have brought trouble on me by making me a stench to the Canaanites and the Perizzites, the people living in this land. We are few in number, and if they join forces against me and attack me, I and my household will be destroyed.'" So fearful, good old Jacob the fearful. So he's fearful and he's mad. He didn't angry. He didn't know they were going to do this. And they said, but they replied, "Should he have treated our sister like a prostitute?" In other words, it was like, well, you weren't going to do anything about it. I mean, so what I'd like to say, this is unresolved conflict.
Yeah, and it's a real insult to him.
Oh, of course it is.
Because they didn't wait for him to react.
Yeah.
They just took it upon themselves. Yeah. And so I'm sure he was just mad as he could
I
be.
am too.
And he probably, I don't want to say he carried a grudge, but he never forgot it.
Oh, you could say he carried a grudge. All three of those guys, Levi and Simeon, were unblessed during his blessing because of that. Yeah. Anyway, the point I wanted, again, I'm trying to get at imagining what the atmosphere must have been like in this family. And the reason I do that is because first of all, it's interesting when the word Torah is translated in the New Testament almost always as law, and people think of it as, thou shalt and thou shalt not. And while there's a fair amount of that, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, is at least 75% stories. It's not law. It's not do this, don't do that. It's stories. And we know from Paul, I think it was, that said all Scripture is written for instruction. So these are to be instructions for us. They're to help us understand how God wants us to live. And so there's nothing wrong with imagining what it might have been like or even must have been like in this household, because it helps us to realize They had the same feelings and emotions we do, right? So, with all that as a preamble, how would you have felt if you were Levi or Simeon or any of the other brothers when you saw your father doting on Joseph and giving him this special many-colored coat, and richly embroidered coat, and treating him differently than he ever treated you? How would you feel? It's hard to imagine you wouldn't feel jealous, right? On the other hand, was Jacob wrong to do that? No, he wasn't wrong. He had the right to do what he wanted to do. He was the head of the household, and he could favor who he wanted to favor. Was it wise? That's questionable. That may not have been the best choice he ever made, but he really wasn't wrong, so you can't really blame Jacob. So if you can't blame Jacob, you got to blame the kids. And the reason I say that is because as I raised my two sons from early childhood, one of the things that constantly rings in my head is this refrain, well, that's not fair. You did it for him, why won't you do it for me? That's not fair. Everything has to be fair. And of course, everybody, they assume, like most people as a matter of fact, that fairness is an absolute thing that everybody just knows, which it's not. And my answer was always the same as, well, life's not fair. I wouldn't say what I think God should have said, which is, well, I'm God and you're not. So if I want to do this, I can do this. That's essentially what Jacob was doing by doing this, was basically saying, I don't care if you don't like it or not. But naturally enough, they were jealous. I just wanted you to put that in your head because I think it's instructional to think about how they felt and sometimes how you and I feel when we're put in different circumstances. If there's any thoughts, we can do that. I'm just going to go on. Yeah, John.
So I'm assuming you read where it says, and Joseph brought an evil report of them?
Yeah, well, I was going to talk about that,
okay.
but that's fine. He brought this evil report. What do you suppose the evil report is?
Well, we know who, to answer your question earlier, we know the character of Joseph.
Yes.
Now, you could argue he learned it as later on as he went on, or he just sort of, this is the way he was from the beginning, or early on in his life when he was the son of the father of his old age kind of thing.
Yep.
He learned a lot from his father.
A sterling character, if you will.
Right.
Yeah.
But, so you could, is Joseph, I'm not trying to give Joseph the benefit of the doubt. Is Joseph simply delivering the report, which the father interprets as evil or insufficient or something? We don't know what exactly the report is. I'm assuming it's first of all, it's half the family, right? It's the children of the concubines.
Well, that's okay. That's a good question. You're interpreting it to say, with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, meaning that's who the brothers are. You could also interpret that to be with his brothers and the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah.
Okay.
So, but your point's still okay.
Maybe one of the conflicts is if these two are separated groups, that's the evil, that there's a conflict between these two, the concubines and the mother, the children of Leah.
Identity politics.
Yeah. But, is the evil report, is Joseph going, I hate these guys, I'm going to write down all kinds of nasty things and give it to the father?
Probably not.
Or is it they're just not doing the things that Jacob expects of them, so therefore it's evil or not good?
Yep. I think, in my opinion, that's the more likely. And of course, from their perspective, from the kids, the brother's perspective, he's going to look like a tattletale, right? They're not doing their job properly. Something's not, something that they're supposed to be doing is not getting done, or they're doing a bad job here or there somehow. And Jacob goes to his father and says, these brothers of mine, these sons of yours, are doing a very poor job of something or other. Or it could even be more flagrant than that. You know what these guys did? It could be something really, really bad. But in any case, there's nothing, certainly at this point, for us to believe that Joseph has any bad motives other than to tell Jacob something that's gone wrong, something that's not happening that should be happening, or vice versa.
I think it is evil. I mean, it is really, really bad, or they wouldn't use the term evil on it.
No, the deeds are bad, but Joseph's motivation's not.
Right. No, I don't think his is either.
Yeah.
And I think he gets an assignment before long, and the brothers figure out a way to put a stop to that.
Oh, yeah. Yep. So we're just setting the stage for that. I'm sure you guys all know the story, but it's interesting to see the dynamics that's going on here. Then verse 4 says, when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. My older brother would sometimes, when I was a little kid, I was kind of a pest. There's no two ways about it. Even I know that. He'd go to my mom and say, boy, I just hate that kid. Luckily, I outgrew it at least a little bit. Anyway.
Comment on that?
Yes.
No, not about you.
Not that, but go ahead.
Well, we've seen recently when some people just hate somebody, right?
Yep.
They just can't think right. They just do stupid. Anybody with any bit of a separation from the whole thing can just see how stupid they act.
Yeah,
It's just
yeah.
foolishness.
Yes. They could not speak a kind word to him.
Right. I mean,
I mean-
who does that kind of remind you of?
Yeah. Verse 5, Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered round mine and bowed down to it. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out what's happening there, right? So his brothers said to him, do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us? And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. So, it's fun to think about this for a while. I mean, do you suppose Joseph imagined that they might react this way? Yeah, I think he probably did. When, I don't know, God still talks to people in dreams, I think, and there's dreams from God and there's dreams that aren't. In giving Joseph the benefit of the doubt, I think he felt like this was important, that this was a dream God had given him, and that he felt like he owed it to them to tell him this. I think, had I been in his shoes, I probably wouldn't have, but that's neither here nor there. What do you think, Marvin?
I think he probably ran off at the mouth and said, boy, did I have a weird dream last night.
It could be that.
And they kept after him to tell him what it was, and they all got upset.
Well, that could be.
Because I think Joseph's he's a pretty smart kid, and I'm sure he didn't go around just starting trouble. I mean, if he was assigned something, he'd do it right,
Yeah, okay.
and the chips would fall where they may. But I think he was smarter than just to.
Hey, listen
Yeah.
to what I know. Yeah, that's a good point. So the scenario would have played forth like, boy, like you said, I had this weird dream last night. And they said, tell us about it. He says, nah, I better not. Oh, come on, tell us. No, it's kind of, never mind. And finally they wheedled it out of him. He told them, and then they get upset. I've had people do me, not about dreams, but people do me that way a lot, right? Tell me what you think. Nah, well, it's okay. Tell me what you really think. Well, it's okay. Finally, okay, here's what I really think. Wow, that's terrible. Well, why'd you ask me? Were you going to say something, John?
Well, it's about, he has another dream. I guess I can wait till then.
Okay. So anyway, his brothers just hate his guts at this point. Verse 9, then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. Listen, he said, I had another dream, and this time the sun and the moon and the 11 stars were bowing down to me. When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, what is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you? And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. So, go ahead, John.
Well, whatever his motivation was, or how naive he was, or foolish, whatever. At the end of the day, this prophecy comes through.
Yeah.
Comes true with
Yeah.
Benjamin,
Yep.
because he has 10 of them, and then he does this thing again where they go get Benjamin, right? The 11th son, and they all bow down to him as the viceroy of Egypt in the future. So if it's not recorded, if they don't, it has no impact if they don't know that. I mean, this dream probably just drove them crazy
Oh, yeah.
that they knew about it.
Yeah.
And then when it comes true, it's like, whoa.
Yeah, they probably didn't even realize or didn't even remember the dream till later on after the unveiling kind of a deal. But they had to, if they couldn't see God in it, they were,
Right.
willfully ignorant. Yeah, that's a good point. There's something else I was thinking about that. This is a total aside. When you think of Joseph in the Bible, usually you think of two things, or at least I always do. One thing is the coat that we just read about, and the other is his dreams. You know, Joseph was a dream interpreter. There's no two ways about it. Although we'll find out whenever he gets a chance to talk about it, he says, it's not me that interprets dreams, it's God. Yeah.
So there was a coat. Remember Jacob got Esau's coat when he did the deception in front of his father?
Hey, that's right.
He went to go bother. He borrowed his coat.
Yeah, to go have a hairy arms or what and
Right.
smell like him. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Interesting. It is fun to pick up little nuances like that. There's a play that's been out for 20, 30 years. Something about Joseph and his Technicolor dream coat. It's a good play. I mean, this story has been around for 3,000 years and has been retold in many different ways. All right, let's see. Moving along, is there anything else I want to say here? Yes, just a second. I'd like you to speak. That's okay. It's a kind of a nuisance, but that way other people can hear too.
I was just wondering, because I had done some research on dreams in the ancient cultures, and some of them, the cultures, and I'm not sure if this was one of them, were dreams. They really lived by their dreams. I mean, that was like they had dream books. That was something that they relied on. So maybe this was part of their cultural.
I think
thing.
you're very much right. And whenever we get to the biggie, the big dream that Joseph gets to interpret in his career, I think it's fascinating because the stuff that's in the dream that just makes so much. Well, we'll talk about it when we get there. Yeah, dreams are a big deal, and God clearly does, and still, I think, talks to people in dreams. I don't know. I can't say over my course of a lifetime I've had more than half a dozen, but I can remember them. They're different than the normal dreams you kind of have during the night, but they're very specific. Some of them were kind of scary. Marvin, did you have anything? You got to take the microphone.
I agree. The Bible doesn't tell us everything that happened during this time period. And like she said, I'd have to think there was a lot of dreams going on. And you would think with the family that these guys are in, they wouldn't scoff at dreams and it wouldn't make them mad. They would, they might not like it, but they wouldn't fight it. If you know what I mean.
That's a good point. That's a very good point. They might not like it. That's, like you say, they wouldn't be able to do anything about it and they'd know it. But that doesn't mean they'd like you say, it doesn't mean, we'll we're going to get to that in just a second here because they do decide to do something about it. Let's see, I think we're all right with that. Let's go on. But you can imagine the atmosphere about that. Let's see, I have a note here. We ought to go to Matthew chapter 20. Oh, I know what that was about jealousy. I probably should have done that earlier, but I'm going to do it now. Turn to Matthew chapter 20. This is the parable of the vineyard, workers in the vineyard. I'll just read it and we'll see what to think about it. This is back on the subject of being envious or jealous. Starting in verse 1, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire men to work in his vineyard. He agreed to pay them a denarius for the day and sent them into his vineyard. About the third hour, he went out and saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing. He told them, "You also go and work in my vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. He went out again about the 6th hour and the 9th hour and did the same thing. About the 11th hour, he went out and found still others standing around. He asked them, "Why have you been standing here all day long, doing nothing?" "Because no one has hired us," they answered. And he said to them, "You also go and work in my vineyard." And evening came, and the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, "Call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last ones hired and going on to the first." The workers who were hired about the 11th hour came, and each received a denarius. So when those who were behind them were hired first, they expected to receive more. But each one of them also received a denarius. When they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. "These men who were hired last worked only an hour," they said, "and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the work and the heat of the day." But he answered one of them, "Friend, I am not being unfair to you. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give the man who was hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I am generous?" I thought that was very applicable to the boys, if you will. I mean, the landowner was right. You know, he can do whatever he wants. And this, I sometimes would use this on my kids because that's the definition of fair. You know, it's unfair. What you've done is unfair. And he says, "What do you mean it's unfair? Didn't you agree to do this?" But it's unfair because you compare yourself to something else, usually somebody else, and you didn't get the same treatment that he got, or something. I don't know. I just think that's a fascinating thing to think about, and to be aware of the fact that it creeps up on you all the time, and even though you think you may have it knocked, you probably don't. I don't. Anyway, I wanted to go back since I had a note here. So let's go on. Verse 12, Genesis 37, verse 12. Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem. So I always have to have my map here so I can talk about that. So they were down here around Hebron, and so they went up back here to Shechem to graze their flock. Now if you remember, not only is Shechem the home of their older brother's deeds of of destruction, Jacob also bought some land up there. Remember, there was that in that story of Dinah and everything. He bought land there, so it's not outside the realm of possibility. He says, "Why don't you take all these sheep up to the northern pasture and try them out up there?" And by this time, like John had talked about, it had been quite a bit of time. People had probably forgotten to some degree what had gone up in Shechem, but I'm sure it was still a ghost town probably at this time. Anyway, so that's where they went. Verse 12, now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem, and Israel, not Jacob for whatever reason, and Israel said to Joseph, "As you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I'm going to send you to them." "Very well," he replied. So he said to him, "Go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me." Then he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. So that's how we know they were in Hebron. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around in the fields and asked him, "What are you looking for?" And he replied, "I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks?" "They have moved on from here," the man answered. "I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. So let's stop there for a minute. Shechem, Dothan. Now all of this, I bet you the distance from Dothan clear down to Hebron is, I doubt seriously if it's certainly not more than 100 miles. It may not be more than 60 miles. So the fact that they could have walked, from down here, up here, he could have probably gotten to Shechem certainly in a couple days, and then in another day he could have gotten to Dothan. So these are not unreasonable distances. And again, I'm always fascinated by the fact that we can find these places. It's always arguable, is Dothan really there? Was it really there? Now, they found, I mean, there's a tell up there. Tell is Hebrew for hill. And being Israel, there's tells everyone. Tel Aviv, by the way. Tel Aviv means spring hill, because Aviv is spring and Tel is hill. So there are hills all over the place where archaeologists have dug all kinds of stuff up, and there's a tell near Dothan that's got a name, something about Dothan. So it probably is Dothan. Yes?
I think one thing we always forget when we're looking at this is that the only way they had to get around, for the most part, was walking.
Yep.
And I don't think they did that in a few days, because they've got, I don't know how many sheep they have with them, but they had a flock. And so it probably took them quite a while to
Yeah.
get up there, because they let the sheep eat all the time.
Yep. No,
And
I think with the sheep, you're right. Joseph,
Right.
not so much. Right?
Well,
Because
60
Joseph was
if
doing
it's
his-
60 miles, he didn't do it in 2 days.
You don't think so?
No.
How long could you walk
Yeah.
in a day?
Well, if you're on a paved road out here, quite a ways, but if you're going up and down hills and dirt trails, it may
Yeah.
take you a lot longer.
2-3 days could be very, very much too short. You're right. You're right. So, and the bottom line is, I don't know. But the distance is, it's not like from here to Albuquerque or something. I mean, it's not that far. So, Payson is about 60 miles. Boy, I wouldn't want to walk that. Of course, if I didn't know anything about driving down the Autobahn or cars or anything, it's a little different story. But anyway, so I want to talk a minute about this. He goes to Shechem, can't find him, and he finds some stranger. And the stranger says, well, I heard them say, let's go to Dothan. The only reason I want to talk about that is this whole thing about Dothan, this man. There's some discussion about the man at Dothan. This man saw them wandering around. The discussion kind of falls along two tracks. The Jews, the Jewish sages or whatever, like to for some reason portray this man as an angel, specifically Gabriel. Gabriel was hanging around keeping track of Joseph, and he's the one that came up and said, what are you looking for? There's nothing to support that, but it could be. It could also just be a man. One commentator said that it was considered, well, I'm going to use the word a sin, but that's really not quite right, because that speaks about our God. But it was considered extremely cruel to see someone who was kind of in distress or obviously lost and not offer to help them. So, me having been guilty of that sometimes, someone looked like they need help, I'll kind of look the other way. Just don't do that. Anyway, so that was the other reason why this is very likely that some man saw the guy looking around, saw Joseph looking around, and said, hey, what are you looking for? Can I help you? Either one could be true. Just interesting. Anyway, the good part then comes in verse 18. Well, let me go back up a little bit before. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. Here comes that dreamer, they said to each other. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns, and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what becomes of his dreams. So they were still hacked off about the dreams. When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. Let's not take his life, he said. Don't shed any blood. Throw him into this cistern here in the desert, but don't lay a hand on him. Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the richly ornamented robe that he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. Now the cistern was empty, and there was no water in it. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Gilead's over here, so you could believe that they would be coming down this way because they're heading down to Egypt, so that'd be the way to head down to Egypt. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, what will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. His brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt.
Comment.
Okay, yes,
So every time this comes up, I bring it up.
I know what you're going to bring up, but go ahead.
King James Version, verse 28. Then there passed by Midianites, merchantmen, and they drew up and lifted up Joseph out of the pit and sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver.
Okay, so it has that the Midianite merchants picked Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him to the Ishmaelites.
Well, that's the King James Version.
That's King James. Yeah, mine says the Midianite merchants came by and his brothers pulled Joseph up out and sold them to the. See, it uses Midianite and Ishmaelite in kind of a synonymous form, and that's really not fair because they're not synonymous. Just for the sake of argument, where are the Ishmaelites from?
Ishmael,
Ishmael, right? They're descendants of Ishmael. Where are the Midianites from?
they're the
Descendants of Midian. Where'd Midian come from? Midian was the son of Abraham by Keturah, his second wife. So the Midianites and the Ishmaelites can't be the same people. But I have a note in my Bible that basically says there's a bunch of, it says very, very illustratively, Samaritan, Pentateuch, Septuagint, Vulgate, and Syriac. See also verse 28, Masoretic text, Midianites. So this would imply that a lot of the texts have those words
well,
goofed up.
my big, whether this the Midianites or the Ishmaelites, the King James says that it wasn't Joseph's brother who they. The implication is, if you read the King James, they didn't know anything about it. They were ready to do something. They had intent, but didn't actually do it.
Okay. And so by the time, according to that, then by the time the brothers go over to see where he is, he shouldn't be there.
He should be there.
Why? Because they'd already bought and paid for him and took him.
Well, I guess you're right. They did say they wanted to pay. Why not sell him for money or something? But I'm just saying they didn't actually They didn't. Remember, Reuben is over here trying to.
Well, we'll talk about the Reuben thing. As a matter
Right.
of fact, we should probably do that now.
I'm just saying in this verse, it doesn't say in the King James that it was the brothers. The Midianites, they lifted up. The Midianites picked them up, and then they sold them to the Ishmaelites, right?
Yep.
They got paid for it, not the sons.
Okay. Well, could be.
Their motive is still not good. I can't
Yeah,
defend
that's
that.
fine. That's fine. But let's do, since you brought it up, go back and talk about Reuben. It would appear that Reuben, like based on verse 21, when Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. Let's not take his life, he said. Don't shed any blood. Throw him into the cistern here in the desert and don't lay a hand on him. Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So the Bible's very explicit to tell us that Reuben really didn't want this to happen and had in his mind a way to prevent it from happening, right? Why might Reuben feel that way?
Well, but his commentary is he didn't really act on it. He wasn't insistent on doing it right then. He was like his father. He's kind of I don't want to get my brothers mad at me,
Yeah.
my other brothers, even because if he doesn't do it, I mean, he's the oldest of them, and he's the one that the father's going to go to him.
Yeah.
Jacob's going to go to Reuben and say,
How could you let this happen?
"Would you?" Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. That's kind of what I was looking for. Is Reuben, of all of them, would be the most responsible. Yeah.
Now I'm confused. The brothers threw him in the pit or the cistern.
Yeah.
We don't know that they stayed close by because they've got sheep they've got to watch. They probably didn't go
Yeah.
very far. But who are we saying took him out of the...
Well, I think his brothers did. John seems to think it could be the Midianites, but I think his brothers did. But Reuben wasn't with them.
Right.
In my story, in my understanding, Reuben went off to do something else for a little while, and he intended to come back and when they weren't looking, he was going to take Joseph out. That's my understanding of what's going on here. But
Right.
it could be wrong.
And how do you think, if the brothers didn't take him out, how do you think they got paid?
Who says they did?
Okay, that's a good point.
Well,
Now-
no, because there is the 20 shekels, or the 20 pieces of silver. Have we come across that yet?
Yeah.
It says, so the Midianite merchants came by. His brothers, mine says his brothers, but John says there's a confusion about that.
Right.
Pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites. So this would have the Midianites walk along minding their own business saying, wow, look, there's a guy down here in the cistern.
And he's
Let's pick him
hollering
up
at
and
it,
sell
and-
him. Yeah,
and he's
hollering.
yelling at us.
Yeah, let's pick him up, and then we can say, okay, oh yeah, we got this guy. We'll sell him to you for 20 shekels of 20 pieces of silver.
Okay. Now,
Boy, what a good day for them.
I'd like to ask a question in the future.
Okay.
When he sees them, when Joseph sees them, when they come looking for food, does he ever bring this up that they sold him? You with me?
Well,
Because
I don't know that
right now we know that they put him in the pit,
yeah.
but we don't know. We're not sure whether they were the ones that actually sold
Okay,
him.
I see where you're going with that. Even if they weren't the ones that pulled him out and sold him, they are the ones that caused him to be pulled out and sold. So his going into slavery in Egypt was their fault, even though they may not have physically done it. Fair point.
But it might Joseph might look at them in a completely different light if he thought they just threw him in the pit to get even with him for his dreams, and the next thing he knows he's in Egypt and he didn't see his brothers.
Maybe they didn't intend for that to happen.
Right, and maybe
That could,
yeah, I don't know.
I know.
don't know.
That could be, but that's not consistent with the text that talks about they wanted to kill him. So actually, getting off by being sent to Egypt was better.
We want to kill him. Now let's make some money off him. Or Reuben, now let's wait a little bit and we'll pick him up later.
Well,
you got
Reuben,
your choice.
yeah, that's right.
You have
But
three choices.
Reuben wasn't telling anybody about his plan.
But Joseph didn't hear them talking about killing him. He wasn't there. He was
That's true.
coming.
That's true,
So
too.
that wouldn't have entered his mind.
Okay, that's all right. It's fun to kind of analyze this. I don't know where it gets us because the upshot of the whole thing is Joseph gets taken off to Egypt, right? But let's go ahead and finish this because I can at least save Reuben's reputation, all right? 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites who took him to Egypt. Verse 29. When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. He went back to his brothers and said, "The boy isn't there. Where can I turn now?" So Reuben's upset. Reuben is surprised that he's missing, and he knows that he's going to have to go back and face his dad, and he's not looking forward to that. He says, "Where can I turn now?" So Reuben, for all his failings, had hoped to be able to do the right thing. Okay, verse 31, it gets really interesting. Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They took the ornamented robe back to their father, and they said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe." Not our brother's robe, but your son's robe. He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." And then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "in mourning I will go down to the grave to my son." So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard.
One comment about what you just read. Reuben didn't get any of the money. If the boys got it, because they never leveled with him.
But they probably didn't. Well, not only that, but Reuben wouldn't have wanted it anyway.
Right.
Yeah. What do you think about this episode? Go ahead, John. What do you have?
Well, it's kind of like, you see the pattern of what Jacob did to Isaac, right?
Yep.
He was deceptive towards him, and it was interesting. They put blood on the coat on that. Didn't they put blood on his coat too? Maybe they didn't.
No, they didn't.
Because they wanted to make him think he was out in the field anyway.
Yeah.
It was. They may not have known what exactly happened to him, but they were sure going to be okay with letting their father conclude that he was dead.
Yes.
He was killed.
Yeah. And
so
I thought the way they presented it was pretty cruel. I mean,
Right.
look what we found. Do you know whose this is?
Well, what are they supposed to say if they don't confess?
Well, they could have kind of couched it. Oh, I think we might have some bad news for you. We found this, and I think, quite frankly, they were shocked at the reaction they got from Jacob. That's my opinion.
Well, this is why it goes back to what it's important to understand. Did they pull him out or not? Because if they didn't pull him out, then they don't know for sure.
Oh, I'm not going there. I mean, why else would they kill the goat and put the blood all over the coat?
Because his sons, where's Jacob? Where's Joseph? Did he get raptured? I mean, where is he?
All right.
We may be overthinking it, because if you really think about that, you got these brothers out there watching the sheep, and this went down because they're going to, in this scenario that's going on now, they're going to lie to their dad.
Mm-hmm.
And they're going to keep that lie.
20 years they keep
20
that lie.
years. It would have been a lot easier just to look and say, Dad, he didn't show up. What are you talking about?
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. That's
And
true.
That would have been an easier one to
Yeah,
keep
yeah.
than to
That's
mess
true. Why
around
would
with
they
the
have messed
coat.
around with the coat?
Right.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, we got some. Isn't this fun?
I just wanted to make one observation, is that Abraham's weakness was he lied, he deceived.
Jacob, but yes.
Abraham did. Then Jacob,
Okay.
when he says, "Oh yeah, Sarah's my
Oh,
sister."
I see. Sure.
Okay, so we
sure.
have a little seed there.
Yep.
And it goes on to Jacob, who multiplied it.
Yeah, who
more.
grew it.
And now we have this,
Yeah.
which is a really much bigger. So, like God says, the sins of the fathers are visited. on the
That's a
children
good point.
and
Yep.
grandchildren.
That
So-
fits. That fits. I think one of the things that's fun to think about is how much more, let's see, the deception that Jacob has fallen under here is just cruel. I mean, that's just a terrible thing to do to a person. And, if you will, God allowed it to happen. I mean, in some sense, it was Jacob's deserved outcome for what he did. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Did you have some, John, or no? But like you were saying, they had to keep this secret for.
You said it was 20 years?
We're going to calculate later that it was 20 years.
Well, it's 20 years before Jacob returns back to his,
To Egypt?
until he leaves Laban and comes back. It doesn't go directly to his father, but
Nope, yep, that's true.
so that's interesting.
Yep, that is interesting. So, if you think the atmosphere was great around Jacob's family now, or then, what do you think it's going to be now? I mean, his sons and daughters tried to comfort him, but he would not be comforted. And Jacob had made no bones about the fact that Joseph was it. He was the one, and now he's dead and gone.
Well, I'm guessing that the next chapter is about Judah, that whole story with him, which is on its surface seems completely out of context. Is that the next chapter?
Yep.
And I think, he's like, oh man, this place is just too, I can't be here. I got the guilt so bad that I just can't be in it. Well,
No, that's exactly right. I even have in my notes here, as I'm going to talk about Judah and Tamar, why he left home. It's probably because the place was just this depressing pit, and he says, man, like you say, I got to get out of here. This place is terrible. Everybody's running around all downcast, and you can't even talk to Dad. So it must have been horrible, really.
What I find amazing about this is Elohim let you make the decisions you really got ahead to make. If you want to make them, you can make them,
Yeah.
whether they're stupid or not.
Yep.
And so he had already determined that the blessing was going to go to Jacob.
Yep.
He didn't have to do anything. And when he got involved in it and did it by trickery and lying,
That enabled
that
all of this
spawned
to
all
happen.
this. It would have been real interesting to know how this would have turned out
Oh,
if
yeah.
it had just let God do his thing.
Yeah, I agree, and that's why I often think about that time that John talks about too, when his mother Rebecca goes to Jacob and says, "Quick, hurry! You know, Esau's going to go out and kill some game and give the blessing to get Isaac to bless him. You go out and kill some goats and go to your dad, pretend to be your dad, and rather, I mean, he did say in Jacob's favor, he did say that'll never work. I mean, he says that's not a good idea. And his mother said, "Oh, just do it." And he said, "Well, he did." He said, "Okay," and he did it. But you know good and well, there's probably not a night in his life he didn't think, "Geez, I wished I hadn't done that." And God would have figured it out some other
Right.
way that wouldn't have been anything, the story would have been completely different. But the story's this way for us.
Right, right. Well, it's interesting because Rebecca knew about the relationship with God.
Yes.
And even though she was told that Jacob was going to get the blessing, she didn't have enough faith to believe it when she
Yep,
heard that.
that's exactly
And that's
right.
really interesting.
That is interesting. Well, in Rebecca's favor, she wasn't raised with God, right? She learned about God from her husband and her father-in-law, if you will. And her actions showed a real lack of faith. There's no two ways about it. Not only that, but it was a pretty harebrained scheme. Yeah. So, anyway, I love this story because, like I say, the more you think about it, the more you realize that, as Jacob or as Joseph's going to end up saying, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. But I think he could have, as you said, achieved the same outcome at far less cost to particularly Jacob in some other way that we can't even imagine. Yeah, I agree. So, okay, we'll move on to chapter 38. At that time, Judah left his brothers and went down to stay with the man of Adullam named Hira. And that's cueing John's comment about, who wouldn't want to leave, the atmosphere around there. I think, man, I'm out of here. I got to go somewhere else. So named Hira, a man of Adullam. Well, we'll find out more where this is in a minute. There Judah met the daughter of a Canaanite man named Shua. He married her and lay with her. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son, who was named She conceived again and gave birth to a son and named him Onan. She gave birth to still another son and named him Shelah. It was at Kezib that she gave birth to him. Okay, so we have Judah goes off some other place, says, "I'm out of here. This is too depressing for me." Is with his good buddy named Hira, who was a Canaanite. No, he met a Canaanite man named Shua, and he married this daughter, his daughter. Never says what her name is, by the way. Not that it matters. Judah got a wife for Now, there's so she has 3 kids in one verse. No, 2 verses, I guess. 3 verses. And then Judah gets a wife for the firstborn in the next verse. So there's, either the kid was very, very young or this happened. There's the number of years between verse 4 and verse 5, or verse 5 and verse 6. Judah got a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the Lord's sight, and so the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, "Lie with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law to produce offspring for your brother." But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, and so whenever he lay with his brother's wife, he spilled his semen on the ground to keep from producing offspring for his brother. what he did was wicked in the Lord's sight, so he put him to death also. Okay, so let's talk about this for a little bit. If nothing else, these sons were probably pretty close in age. He gets a wife. Judah first gets a wife for his oldest son, And it doesn't say, but did something that God found particularly offensive, particularly reprehensible, and God just basically took him out. And that left wife, Tamar, a widow. There is a thing that we're going to read about in the book of Deuteronomy called the law of Levirate marriage. The law of Levirate marriage says that if two brothers in a family, if two brothers in the family are married and one brother's wife dies, then it's the other brother's task to take her as his wife, and whatever offspring she has carries the name of the dead husband. So that's so that the dead husband doesn't go away unremembered. One of the major benefits of this is the widow. Because in this culture, widows were not treated real well. I mean, it was a foregone conclusion typically that you were poor and you were going to have a hard life because you probably weren't going to get married again, and there was no way other than menial labor that you were going to make anything. So this was a way to for a widow to regain some possibility of a life and a family. So I think, that's just my opinion, I think that's the main reason for this. It's not so much about keeping the son's family name alive as it is just taking care of the family. Yeah, it might be inheritance. It could be that. It certainly would mean that the estate would be, would be divided as it was, as it should have been. Yeah, who knows? But anyway, it was a law, and obviously it was in place here because Judah goes to the second son, Onan, and says, "Lie with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law to produce offspring for your brother." But Onan knew that his offspring would not be his, so whenever he lay with his brother's wife, he spilled his semen on the ground to keep from producing offspring for his brother. It's my understanding that the way this worked, the first offspring was his brother's. The next ones and thereafter were his. So I don't think it was forever. I think it was just once. I'm pretty sure that's the way it was. But in any case, Onan was having none of it. So he wouldn't do it, and God was equally offended at that, so he did Onan in. Yes?
The Torah hadn't been written yet.
Yeah.
And so this was put in place for a reason, and I think one of the reasons was when they come out of the land of Egypt, they can keep the land that's divided among the tribes in the tribe. So there is some inheritance to it.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I don't know that it applies here, but it's considered. He doesn't change, so it was that way from the beginning.
Yep.
But I think that's where this really comes into play.
Yep. That's fine. One of the things you did bring up, which I've often found interesting, is that they didn't have the Torah. How'd they know this? Well, it's taken me a while, a number of years, but I've finally come to believe that basically they were told the Torah, heck, way back in the beginning. No one knew it. No one knew enough to take multiple pairs of clean animals because he needed to have something to sacrifice when the water receded. So no one knew of it. Heck, Cain and Abel must have known something of it because they knew to sacrifice an animal. Abel knew to sacrifice an animal at the beginning. So the Torah must have been known. It just wasn't written. Moses was the guy that wrote it. Yeah. John?
So I had a question about Judah marrying a Canaanite.
Yes.
Is that worse than Esau marrying a Hittite or whatever?
It's the same thing. As a matter of fact, I'm sure this was a bad deal as far as God was concerned.
Right.
But God is able to take those punches and roll with them somehow. I think it is interesting that they go out of their way to say a Canaanite. We'll learn here in a minute why this is important.
Do we know where Tamar is from? We don't, do we?
Well, she's the daughter. No, no, Tamar. Let's see. Jude. No, it doesn't. No, we do not know where Tamar is from. Good point. We do not know that. Okay. Let me go on. Verse 11. Judah then said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, "Live as a widow in your father's house now until my son Shelah grows up." So Shelah must have been pretty young. So all of these kids must have been fairly young at the time. For he thought he may die too, just like his brothers. Old Tamar's got a bad track record at this point, right? She's killed 2 husbands already. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. All right, that's what's going on there. Verse 12, after a long time, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. When Judah had recovered from his grief, he went up to Timnah to the men who were shearing his sheep, and his friend Hiram the Adullamite went with him. So Timnah, I found Timnah earlier. Let me see if I can figure out. I think it was... Oops. Well, no, it had to be up here. It's up in here somewhere. Bear with me for a minute because I think there was another name and I found the other name. But anyway, I believe it's near the coast here, somewhere around. Anyway, let me go on. So he goes back to it's sheep shearing time. After a long time, Judah's wife, okay. When Tamar was told, your father-in-law is on his way to Timnah to shear his sheep, she took off her widow's clothes, covered herself with a veil to disguise herself, and then sat down at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that, though Shelah had now grown up, she had not been given to him as his wife. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. Not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law, he went over to her by the roadside and said, "Come now, let me sleep with you." "And what will you give me to sleep with you?" she asked. "I'll send you a young goat from my flock," he said. "Will you give me something as a pledge until you send it?" she asked. And he said, "What pledge should I give you?" "Your seal and its cord and the staff in your hand," she answered. So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. After she left, she took off her veil and put on her widow's clothes again. Okay, so we need to at least make sure we know what's gone on here, right? Judah lost his wife, and so he's probably he says after his grief, time of mourning or whatever, verse 12 says, when Judah had recovered from his grief, he went up to Timnah to talk to his good old buddy Hiram, the Adullamite, and see how the sheep shearing was going. And Tamar heard about it and says, Shelah's long since grown up now, and it's really, he's supposed to be my husband. So she lays this little trap by waiting outside this town, small town in Nahum. And she sits there and looks alluring, I guess. And Judah decided to proposition her, which she accepts. And they agree on this goat, which he doesn't have with him. And she says, "So what pledge will you give me so that I know that you'll give me the goat?" And he says, "Well, I'll give you," or she suggests, "I want your seal, your ring, and your staff." Those are more valuable than the goat, certainly to Judah, but they're also very personal. There will be no question as to whose these are, right? So Judah says, "Okay, fine," and then does the deal and leaves without his staff and his seal and his ring. And then, well, we're going to find out what happens later. But she becomes pregnant, right? Go figure. Verse 20. Meanwhile, Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adullamite in order to get his pledge back from the woman, but he did not find her. He asked the men who lived there, "Where is the shrine prostitute who was beside the road at Enaim?" "There hasn't been any shrine prostitute here," they said. So he went back to Judah and said, "I didn't find her. Besides, the men who live there said, 'There hasn't been any shrine prostitute here.'" And then Judah said, "Let her keep what she has, or we will become a laughingstock. After all, I did send her this goat, but you couldn't find her." So, in other words, I tried to do this, and he's just going to suffer the loss of his staff and seal and all that stuff. Yes, John?
So I was going to bring up earlier about when Judah said to his brothers, "Hey, let's sell him instead of kill him," right? Now you could say, well, and looking at it a positive way, he's trying to de-escalate it.
Yes. Yes.
Instead of like, hey, let's make some money on this deal. Like, what are we doing here? This is
He's
stupid.
trying to avoid killing him.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, a cynical way would say that he's trying to
Make money.
make money on it.
Yeah. No, I agree with what you said about save him.
Well, because if it wasn't so, if he was all about money, then not having these instruments, I think makes it hard for him to go about and do business and
Yep.
things like that.
Yep. That's a good point.
But
Okay.
but because he's kind of indifferent about it after he finds out that's like, oh well, we tried.
Yeah.
I'd be more worried about being fooled by this woman than I would be by getting my stuff back, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a reference to the term laughing stock. He says, we don't want word about this to get out because we'll look like I'll look like an idiot who gave her all this valuable stuff as a pledge for a goat, and then she disappears with my valuable stuff. And I don't want to look like an idiot. So he says, let's just forget about the whole thing. Don't tell anybody, kind of a deal. Is that kind of where you're going with that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have an answer, but it's like he doesn't really have value. Those things are important.
Yeah, he doesn't appear to be a
He doesn't
materialistic, money-grubbing kind of guy.
Well, but still, those things are important. I mean,
Yeah.
he just doesn't seem to be.
They're not as.
I think he just experienced something similar to what his father did. Of course, his son didn't actually die, but
Yeah.
his two sons did die. So he's like, Judah's got to be in the pits himself.
That's a good
He's
point.
gotta-
Yeah. Oh, the whole family's got to be real depressed. Yeah.
Those items that he gave her, he probably went to Office Max and got some others. No, I'm being facetious with that, but
he
could
them.
replace them.
Sure, he could.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, let's move on a little bit. Verse 24. About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar is guilty of prostitution, and as a result, she's now pregnant." Judah said, "Bring her out and have her burned to death," which was, I guess, the current thing to do for someone that got pregnant. Anyway, went out of marriage. As she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law, Judah. "I am pregnant by the man who owns these," she said, and she added, "See if you recognize whose seal, cord, and staff these are." Judah recognized them and said, "She is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her my son Shelah," and he did not sleep with her again. Now, this is kind of a turning point for old Judah, right? Because certainly earlier in his life, and certainly a couple of his brothers would have gotten mad, figured out somehow to get even, and, hidden the whole thing somehow or another. But he immediately admitted, well, she was right. She caught me, and I had totally forgotten her, hoped that she would go away so I wouldn't have to deal with this issue, but I guess I am. And so he must have had to confess it, because people were going to someday come around and say, "Gee, I thought you were dead." And she said, "Oh, no, not only am I dead, but it turns out I got twins." Anyway, verse 27, "When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. And as she was giving birth, one of them put out his hand. So the midwife took a scarlet thread and tied on his wrist and said, "This one came out first." But when he drew his hand back, his brother came out, and she said, "So this is how you have broken out." And she named him Perez, which means to break out. Then his brother, who had a scarlet thread on his wrist, came out, and he was given the name Zerah, which means scarlet. So she had twins. Why is that important? All right? Well, I have the reason. You probably know the reason. First Chronicles chapter 2. Chronicles is after Kings. I think. Chapter 2. Starting in verse 3. Well, we can start, verse 3. This is a chronology of Israel's sons, or the genealogy. It says, to Hezron's sons, the sons of Judah, Onan, and Shelah. These three were born to him by a Canaanite woman, the daughter of Shua. Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death. Tamar, Judah's daughter-in-law, bore him Perez, Zerah, and Zerah. Judah had 5 sons in all. So the sons of Perez were Hezron and Hamul, and the sons of Zerah were Zimri, Ethan, Heman, Calcol, and Darda, 5 in all. And then it goes on. The main interest we have here is, if you move down to verse 10, Ram was one of those offspring of the sons of Hezron, of Perez. Ram was the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab was the father of Naxon and leader of the people of Judah. Naxon was the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, Boaz the father of Obed, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse was the father of all these people, but finally Jesse was the father of David. So that's a lot of the reason that story is in there, but it's so that you understand, the genealogy can be traced back all the way to Judah. So it's an interesting story. I remember, I'm digressing, but that's okay. There's a set of movies out. You should find them. It's called Lube Productions, Lube, Lube Productions, and there's one called Abraham, there's one called Jacob, and there's one called Joseph. They're really, really good. The one by Joseph, the one called Joseph, is particularly good. It's got Ben Kingsley in it, who plays Potiphar. It's a long movie, but I remember the reason I'm going into this is before I really ever got into this stuff, I remember that movie was playing on television one night. This was a long time ago, and I was sitting in the living room, happened to be watching the movie, and I thought, well, this will be fun. I mean, I was a kind of a half-hearted Bible student. I knew the stories and some of this stuff, and I thought, well, I'll be able to pick out all the places where these Hollywood geniuses have invented things that weren't there just in order to make the story better, So I was watching it, and I thought it was a good movie. It was captivating. There was a well-done thing. And then they got to this story about Tamar, and they went through the whole thing. It was done, tastefully enough, and I remember thinking, that's not there. That's the dumbest thing I ever heard of. Why would that story even be in the Bible? I didn't get it. And so I got my Bible out, and I thought, I'll be darned, it's there. And it's exactly the way the story was written, exactly the way they portrayed it. So I think they played it over 2 or 3 nights because it was kind of a long movie. So I sat there for the rest of the movie, watching it with my Bible open, trying to catch them on different things. And I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's pretty good. And it really gives you some insight. We'll talk about it more as we get into the story, but In particular, I always had troubles with, why did you put the cup in Benjamin's sack, and why did you send him back, and why did you do all these different things? And that helped me understand why they did all that. We'll discuss it as we get through all this in the story. But all of that stuff is, I used to read this stuff and thought, even now, I got to admit, I still read certain details and I think, I don't have any idea why that's there. I wouldn't have wasted the ink to put that sentence there because it means nothing to me. But it's there for a reason. I just haven't figured it out yet. And the same is true with everything in here. Some of them we may never know till we get there. But there's a lot of stuff that's coming up in the remaining part of Genesis and the story of Joseph that's fun to read because we'll be able to see kind of why it happened. And it's all associated with people being people and the lessons that God wants us to learn from these stories. So I just wanted to say that because I think it's good. Anyway, if you get the chance to go look at those Lube productions, I think you'd like them. They're really, really worth the time. And you can get them on DVD, through Amazon, anywhere. So, push it up, and then you have to wait for a couple seconds. Could be battery less. Push it down and try it. I don't know. Tell John to fix the microphone. Oh, must be dead. Go ahead, just yell it out and maybe I can repeat it. Yeah. They don't portray, yeah. Yes, they say they're Judas. Well, they were Judas. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Yep, yep. Yeah. It is interesting. That's interesting. Yep. I find it interesting that we can take text like this that's as old as it is and been translated as many times as it has and have discussions like this that still manage to hold together. So it's really pretty fascinating that it describes real life to a large degree. Yeah. Any other thoughts? We're quitting a little early tonight, but I don't want to start the next part until week after next, if you will. So thank you for coming. I appreciate it. So let me close in prayer. Well, Father God, thank you for the evening. Thank you for this story, as well as many of the stories in the Torah, especially in Genesis. Help us to think on these things. Help us to think about how they apply to us today in our life. Help us to think about the way they are presented to us and what it means to have them here, again, after all this time. And just help us to understand how far-reaching you are, how you've had this plan from the beginning. You know the end. You knew the end from the beginning, and we're just players, if you will, Father God. And help us to be willing tools to do the things that you want us to do. Help us to be obedient to your word, and help us to just listen carefully to all that you're trying to teach us. Keep us safe till we meet together week after next. In Yeshua's name, amen. Thanks very much, and we'll do it again.